Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners curious about these topics and interested in educating themselves about how they work in practice. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. This episode is produced and co-hosted by the Mergers and Acquisitions Committee of the Antitrust Law section. And with it, we kick off the second season of our popular Mergernomics series, in which we demystify some of the tools, tests, and analyses used by economists in merger review. Today's episode is on efficiencies. The economic analysis of mergers is often an attempt to describe with scientific rigor something that is inherently unknowable, what the world will look like if a particular merger goes through. We try to use numbers to describe how bad a merger could be by quantifying things like what kind of market power the merged firm will have, or whether it would make economic sense for it to raise prices or cut supply, or restrict access to some critical input that its competitors need. At the same time, we balance it out by trying to determine what the benefits of the merger will be, the why of the transaction, if you will, with as much certainty as we can. And that's where the analysis of these benefits, or efficiencies as we call them, comes in. And even if you don't have a background in economics or many years of experience, it doesn't matter. This episode is intended for people of all levels of experience to understand how to answer a deceptively basic question. What is the upside of this merger? Joining me today to walk us through the efficiencies analysis is my co-host, Paula Camara. Paula is a partner in the law firm Mattos, Filho, located in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where she represents both Brazilian and international clients on a broad range of competition matters. Welcome back to the show, Paula.
Thank you so much, Anant. Such a great joy to be here again with you.
And our guest today is Silvia Faga. Silvia holds a PhD in economics and is the founding partner of Ecoa Consultoria Economica, an economic consulting firm based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Welcome to the show, Silvia.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's going to be a pleasure to discuss this topic with you guys.
Paula, what are we going to be explaining to our listeners today?
Well, today we're actually, as you mentioned, Anant, kicking off the second season of Mergernomics series. So in the first part of the series, we have unpacked the role of an economist in merger analysis, and we discussed each of the main tools that the economists use for their analysis. And during the second season, if I may give some spoilers, we will discuss specific situations like specific cases and delve into, I would say, more practical use of those economic tools that we learned during season one. So today we'll kick off by discussing the economic tools used by economists to analyze merger efficiencies. So before handing to Silvia, let me just maybe begin by setting the stage and giving a little bit of the concept of merger efficiencies, which you sort of already did, Anant. So what really are merger efficiency and why do they matter to antitrust? So when two companies merge, they often claim that the merger will make them more efficient, meaning like they can produce goods at lower costs or improve quality or innovation and so on. And so these are the benefits that you mentioned coming from a merger, coming from two companies combining their operations. So why does it matter to antitrust analysis? Competition authorities like CADE in Brazil or the European Commission or the DOJ FTC in the US, they will usually analyze whether a merger will harm competition, for instance, by raising prices or reducing consumer choice. But if the merger might reduce competition, the companies may as well just say that the efficiency will offset those harms. So, for instance, the merger company will say, oh, even though there will be fewer competitors, the merger will lower costs so much that it will also lower prices to consumer. That's the logic behind it. I know it's very rarely, in fact, Silvia and I were discussing the other day, in Brazil, never has a merger been approved only because of efficiency. It's usually done together with remedy analysis or in addition to other mitigating factor. But actually, one of the main reasons, at least that I see, that it's so important to involve economists early on in this stage if you want to analyze efficiencies is that we want to quantify them correctly and show to the authority that they are valid. So this is why actually regulators, they do apply very strict criteria to ensure that those efficiencies, they are real, that they are meaningful, and not just something that the merging parties will use to increase their own profits. So, for instance, and I know that this criteria is sort of the same around CADE and DOJ and European Commission. They must first be specific to the transaction, so they must come because of the merger and not because of something that the companies could do on their own, for instance. They have to be verifiable, like realistic and supported by evidence. And this is, again, how the economists come in. And they have to be passed on to consumer. For me, that's the hardest one to prove, because how do you prove that the companies will not use the efficiency simply to increase their profits, but actually to offset any potential harm that merger could do? So that was the quick pitch on what we're talking about. And then I will begin by handing over to Silvia and ask you, Silvia, what kind of efficiencies are the ones that are most likely to influence pricing and to be actually passed on to consumers, like I mentioned?
Well, good introduction, Paula. And if I may start discussing a little bit about the concepts and give an example about what are the main efficiencies that used to be considered by CADE, it is important to have in mind that some of them are related to fixed costs, and they are usually the most intuitive ones related to merger and acquisitions, the ones that are related to scale and scope synergies. What are they? Scale synergies related to reduction in cost when you increase the amount of the production. And scope is the same kind of impact when you increase the sort of productions of products that you're going to produce. So usually when you merge companies, you may face an increase on the output and an increase on the set of products that you're going to offer. So it's quite intuitively that you're going to have economies of scale and economy of scope. But usually, this kind of the sources of synergies tends to be related to fixed costs. You are diluting the fixed costs of the company. But we need to understand that this is not the most the kind of synergies that the authorities are looking for, because the ones that the authorities care the most is the ones related to variable cost. Why? Because the variable cost is the one that's going to affect the price policy of the companies. So whenever you have a cost reduction that depends on the volume commercialized, this is when you have the company have incentives to translate this cost reduction into the price policy. And this is when you're going to face a bigger incentive for you to reduce price to consumers. So this is when it's more likely for the company to have the synergies being shared with the consumers, which is the one of the main criteria that the authority tends to assess to check if the synergy is going to be considered in the assessment of the authority. So those are the main groups of synergies. And inside the variable cost type of synergies, the cost reductions may depend on logistics or be related to supply chain optimization, may be related to transaction costs that you can reduce due to the transaction. So there are a lot of sources that can be related to this group. It should be dependent on the case that you're assessing. One important thing that you should have in mind that usually you have those fixed cost group of synergies being relevant, and it should be presented, especially because it may affect important sectors of the economies, like infrastructure sectors, or even the ones that's going to deal directly with the consumers, like retail. And we do have a lot of cases, at least in Brazil, but certainly abroad as well, related to those kind of sectors, like we have deals related to aviation sector, to food retail, to healthcare services, private services. So we do have a lot of examples in which fixed costs are going to be one of the sources of efficiencies.
Yeah, it makes complete sense, and I think it was a great introduction because you gave a few examples of merger inefficiencies, what are them, and what are the main ones. And I wanted to maybe give a step further and break down a little bit on some of the ones that you just mentioned. I think you told a lot about reduction in costs, and I think that there are a few efficiencies that can lead to cost reduction. That for me, it's the most obvious, maybe, so to speak, efficiency. So I wanted to discuss a little bit on the elimination of double marginalization, because that's the way that use a lot in vertical mergers, and maybe a very one that's very easily that's very easy to visualize. So let's begin by saying, what is it, and when does it lower prices?
Yeah, this is an important one. It's not so easy to be measured, but let's start explaining first what they mean. What is double marginalization? Considering Tirol, one of the main economists that you have in the field, he used to say something like that. There's the only thing worse than have a monopoly is having a series of monopoly in a production chain. This is the idea that you're going to accumulate the monopoly margins through the chain. And once you have that, you may face a very high price for consumers in the end, and this is going to be very inefficient. Not only because consumers are going to face higher prices, but because you also are going to accumulate the inefficiency related to market power, which is the main problem of market power, which is the deadweight loss, as economists like to say. What is the deadweight loss? To have higher prices, usually companies tend to reduce the quantity that's going to be produced and commercialized. And once they reduce this quantity, consumers are going to face lower offer. This lower offer is another source of inefficiency, actually, that consumers are going to face. So whenever you reduce or eliminate this double or triple or n numbers of marginalization in the production chain, you're going to reduce the inefficiency related to this deadweight loss. So consumers are going to face not only products that are going to cost less, but also a bigger set or a big amount of products being offered in the market. So this is the inefficiency related to monopoly power. And whenever we eliminate the source of inefficiency, you are going to increase consumer welfare.
I see. No, it makes sense. And if I can trying to translate it to myself, a non-economist, like in an actual real life example to see how it works. So I'd say that double marginalization would, for instance, occur when two firms in a supply chain each mark up their prices as you may say, as a monopoly, so you speak. So the inefficiency is like that. Like, so for instance, if you take the retail market, you have the upstream firm, like a manufacturer, for instance, set the price to maximize its own profit, of course. So you have the downstream firm, like a distributor or a retailer, then add its own markup to that price, which results in a very high price to consumer. And like you said, lower offer, which would then result in a deadweight loss. So that's where the efficiency would be like, because then the upstream and then downstream firms would merge and then lower prices and then increasing offer. Would that be a fair way to put it?
Yeah, it's a very fair way to put it in a very intuitive way. We can also find it in different sectors, not only retail. Whenever we have different segments of the chain negotiating, and you have market power in the different level of the chain, you may face this kind of problem. Another example that you may face is the healthcare private sector. We also have the hospital negotiating with health insurance companies. If both of them have market power, and they tend to be markets that are more concentrated because you do have a lot of economies of scale, economies of scope. So this kind of characteristics tends to concentrate the market. It is easy to find this double marginalization. I mean, whenever I have a vertical integration with a hospital, including a hospital and a healthcare company, we have this double marginalization being eliminated, and then consumers tend to have a broader range and a broader number of services being offered with reduced price.
Right. Right. Let me actually pick up from what you just mentioned, because you mentioned scale of economies of scale and scope, and these examples on the healthcare sector, which is one that I know that in Brazil, and I know for sure that in many other jurisdictions are a very good example because of all these relationships that you just explained. But picking up from there, we know that economies of scale and scope are also a very common source of cost reduction in terms of merger efficiency. So it would be great if you could elaborate a little bit more on those.
Yeah, they tend to be presenting almost any merger or acquisition, because Usually you have synergies related to administrative areas such as marketing, commercial, or supply. So all the administrative area tends to be optimized, and then you reduce the size of the combined company after the deal, and then you can reduce the fixed cost and dilute it with a higher number or a higher production. So this is why you tend to have this kind of synergy in any merger or acquisition. But especially in infrastructure sectors such as telecom, energy, or petrochemicals, you do have a very strong scale economy. This tends to be very important, and this tends to be the motivation of a company to merge with another competitor. But at the same time, the authority tends to understand that this is not going to represent something that's going to be shared with consumers in the short run. And sometimes, if the authority is very conservative, they do not understand that this is going to be an efficiency that justifies the deal if the deal tends to increase prices for consumers. But at the same time, at least in my opinion, in some cases and in some authorities tends to understand that, okay, this is not a synergy that I'm going to use to reduce the price or the pressure for price to be increased after the deal. You need to understand them in the long run, not only in the short run. So this is why it is important for the authorities to bear this in mind, because they need to be efficient in the long run. And this is important because this is going to affect a lot of segments of the economy, not only one specific type of consumer like energy or telecom, that they tend to impact the cost of many other companies in the economy. So this is important for you to guarantee that they are going to operate efficiently in the long run. So this is why I think it is important for you to present this kind of synergy, even though the authorities is not going to consider that this is going to reduce price in the short run. But it certainly is going to be useful for the authority to understand that this deal is pro-competitive, at least in the long run.
Yes, precisely. And one also, and I like to also take a little bit on that to discuss dynamic efficiencies, because when you say of efficiencies that are easily to be put on a number in the short run, I think that kills a little bit the analysis of dynamic efficiencies, which is precisely one that we analyze in the long run. So, because when we are discussing efficiencies like elimination of double marginalization or economies of scale, scope, we tend to think precisely of palpable, easy to calculate, like cost reductions, like those very static efficiencies. So like I have two factories, I'm going to shut one down. So it's very easy to see how this is going to reduce my costs and hence maybe the prices that I'm going to charge consumer. But there are also those less straightforward math of efficiencies that I can say with the merger. And one of them is precisely the dynamic efficiencies that are less obvious, like, for instance, long-term improvement that are not immediate, but that will eventually come with innovation, for instance. Those are harder to verify. We know, of course, but how can we actually include them in the efficiency analysis of a merger case? Is there any, I don't know, maybe practical examples that you could think of?
Yeah, no, totally. This is something really hard, and the whole economy is getting more technological and more based on innovation and dynamic efficiencies. This is why this is getting very important. And as you mentioned before, the static synergies are the ones more prone to be accepted because they are easily or easier to be shown and to be demonstrated for the authorities, and because you're using the available resources that you have now in the economy. So it's for the authorities, especially in Brazil, it's important to show that these synergies are going to be implemented in at most 2 years. This is the concept of short run in Brazil. And dynamic efficiencies or any efficiency that's going to be implemented only after 2 years after the deal is going to be in some level considered as something speculative for the authority. And the dynamic efficiency is going to consider not only innovation that usually you cannot guarantee that you're going to have, but also you're relying on resources that are not really available right now. So it's getting more speculative. rely on things that the company cannot assure right away. So the dynamic efficiency tends to be less acceptable by the authorities right now because they tend to be considered more speculative and because they rely on resources that is not necessarily available right now. So any efficiency that tends to be implemented or tends to be achieved after 2 years after the deal, the authorities is going to consider that at some level this is speculative. But there are some ways that the authorities is going to accept innovation synergies. For instance, when you have patents that can be shared. When you're sharing patents, so one of the company has a patent and the other of the company doesn't have access to this innovation and they merge, they both can have access to the same patent without any additional cost, for instance. So the consumers are going to be exposed to more innovation, to products that are going to be innovated. And this is something that the authorities tends to consider, but it's not so easy to monetize. So this kind of synergies do not tend to be understood as a reduction in cost. And again, taking into consideration the healthcare sector, it's very interesting to see this sector because usually in the healthcare sector, we do have a lot of synergies related to innovation or new products to be implemented in the market, but usually this kind of innovation tends to increase instead of reducing costs. And it's hard to understand the effect on consumer welfare because, well, they may face increasing prices, but at the same time, they are going to face new services or services that's going to be less invasive or that's going to treat or to cure a disease in a more efficient way. So it's hard for us to balance price increase and quality at the same time because they are not measured by the same kind of metric. They're not monetary and they're not related to cost reduction at all. Okay.
Precisely, because when we think of efficiency, we immediately think of cost reduction. And those are maybe the most obvious one, the ones that we discussed earlier, like elimination of double marginalization and economy of scale and scope. But the ones that are not that obvious are maybe the ones that are more important for that specific merger, which is the case, for instance, in healthcare, like you just mentioned, like R&D, which is something that actually increases costs, but then it can improve services offered to consumer. I think the healthcare sector is a very good example of that. And then it comes to how to show that to the authority and how to quantify that, because one of the things that we mentioned is that the efficiency, they can't just be a beautiful story. They have actually to be quantifiable and shown to the authorities that they're likely to be passed on to consumers, and how to do that, like in dynamic efficiencies, that seems an even harder job than the ones done for cost reduction, which are more straightforward, right?
Yes, and it's really hard for us to measure even the traditional ones that we need to measure, such as economy of scale or even cost reduction related to logistics that tends to be verifiable. It's not so easy to measure, especially because unfortunately we do not have any kind of test or methodology that to just apply. It is actually a case-by-case analysis in which usually the economists, the consultants needs to take the information from both company because they're not supposed to share this information with each other because they tend to be very sensitive. So they are not supposed to share beforehand. And even if in the case that we do have independent consultants that had already developed some analysis to base the negotiation of the deal and to give the private synergies that the deal may create, those efficiencies are not necessarily the efficiencies that should be presented to the authorities, especially because sometimes they tend to be private synergies. For instance, sometimes we do have some price decrease related to inputs, but this is not necessarily related to an efficiency scenario. Sometimes they are going to reduce price because after the deal, they are going to have monopoly power, buyer power. If they exercise this power, this is not the kind of synergy that the authority wants to have. You need to understand whether this reduction in input prices are related to the fact that the joint company is going to have a higher volume of product being negotiated. They're going to reduce transaction costs related to this negotiation. So this is an efficiency that the authority wants to hear about, and not the fact that the input is going to reduce its price because we have buyer power after the deal.
Oh, precisely. Yes, that's very useful, and I think that sums up a little bit the issues that we have. First, to demonstrate the efficiencies, and then to put them to an authority in a way that they can quantify them.
And just to complement the discussion about the tools available, we do not have specific tools to assess efficiencies or to calculate automatically the efficiencies, but at the same time, we do have some tests like GUP. GUP is the index that measure the pressure for the company after the deal to increase prices. Sometimes this exercise gives you the amount of efficiencies that should be reached for you to avoid this price increase. So it's not a test that you use to measure efficiencies, but there is at least a way to measure whether this efficiency is going to be big enough for us to eliminate the pressure to increase price after the deal. There is this kind of instrument that's not necessarily so easy to use because, again, you need data, you need to estimate like elasticities and margins for you to be able to estimate this pressure on prices. But it's not so frequently used because of this kind of challenges. But sometimes that you can face this the situation in which it can be helpful for you to understand what is going to be the net outcome of the deal.
So let's know. So Silvia just mentioned that the authorities, they don't really like when we discuss efficiencies, like for instance, when the parties will use their monopsony power to reduce prices by lowering the prices that they pay for a certain input. And I wanted to use that logic to ask you about labor, actually labor force, because over the course of my career, I've seen CAG and the FTC and the DOJ moving forward, treating that elimination of point and back-end jobs as an efficiency, like as a pro-merger efficiency, because that means cost reduction and maybe lower prices to consumer, right? But we've seen for several reasons, and that's across the globe, authorities sort of switching to analyzing this as a bad thing actually for the merger, because the parties can somewhat abuse their monopsony power for the workers of that company, for instance. And at the same time, we have seen like a policy switch in Brazil, for instance. As you know, we've had CAG opening investigations to analyze sensitive information related to HR, precisely because on the potential effects to that labor market. That has also come into play into the merger guidelines in the DOJ and the FTC. So this is something that has changed over the course of the year. So how do you see that play out?
I totally agree that it's changing a lot of concerns related to labor market, and I think it is important to bear in mind that lots of issues may be related to be considering the antitrust analysis, not only labor market, but also things related to sustainability and things related to environment as well. But focus on labor market, we do have two ways to look at the issue. The one that you mentioned before, whenever we are talking about, as I mentioned before, the reduction on overlapping areas such as administrative areas like marketing, commercial, or supply chain, reducing the number of people that's going to work on those areas. And this still tends to be assessed as something pro-competitive in the sense they are going to reduce costs, but at the same time, usually this is related to fixed costs, so it's not really relevant in the end. But at the same time, the authority tends to be more and more concerned with the fact that sometimes when you have companies together that are going to negotiate better salaries, sometimes those better salaries are related to monopsony power. And again, this tends to create deadweight loss. This tends to be related to less employees being hired and less products being produced. and less products being commercialized. So this tends to harm the economy and harm competition in general, because then you are not allocating all the resources the way you should be allocating. One good example that you also have here is, again, looking for the healthcare sector. Healthcare insurance companies, whenever they merge, they can adopt more and more reduced salary policies with the medical services providers, and this is going to be harmful for the clients or for the consumers in the end, not only because we may face less professionals offering the services, but at the same time the quality may be affected again. And then if you have quality being affected, this is a kind of market in which quality matters a lot. So this is something to bear in mind. And I don't think it will have a very strong result of this shift in the antitrust focus on the analysis, but we do know that the authority is trying to pay more attention for the labor market in general.
Yeah, that's true. I completely agree that in general, and for me, it's more like really a policy shift, really, because I think it also comes to the question of whether the antitrust authorities should actually look at the labor market. I know that there's a whole logic, an antitrust logic behind it. If you look at labor as a market in itself, that actually serve any industry, but at the same time, I think I ask myself whether this is something that the authorities should be looking at or not.
Mm-hmm. Finally, to complement, there are other issues that are related to something that is written in the guidelines as something that the authorities should bear in mind, such as quality, diversity, or even positive externalities, or reducing negative externalities, which are the side effects of a strategy. It's written in the guidelines or in the merger guidelines in Brazil, in the US, and other places as well. But at the same time, as mentioned before, they are not measured in monetary terms. So it's hard for the authority to say, okay, if the company is going to bring only synergies of this kind of source of synergy, it's going to be hard for you to accept concentration or market power increase, because they're going to bring some generic and qualitative benefit for the market. But in some sectors, like the ones that tend to impact environment or tend to be related to consumers' health, this kind of impact tends to be very important. And this cannot be disregarded from my point of view.
Yeah. So now I think we've discussed a lot throughout our conversation examples using the healthcare sector and the retail sector, which are very traditional sectors, and maybe the ones that are easiest to visualize because they're highly verticalized. But I wanted to discuss a little bit how all of this play out in digital sectors, because the whole dynamics of the digital market is just so different in terms of cost structure, because of fixed costs that are so different when it comes to traditional markets. So how do you see that playing out in digital market?
I think the digital markets are bringing a whole set of challenges for antitrust authorities. This is why there are, in most jurisdictions, there are discussions related to complementing the antitrust enforcement to be more effective. And this is why, and I think the digital market is a good example that usually the sources of efficiency. So in the digital markets, this kind of synergies tends more to be understood as a barrier to entry, or something that's going to give so many advantage for the incumbents that they're going to be almost a monopolist in the market. So the digital markets tends to rely on a lot of efficiencies. They tend to bring innovation, new products, but at the same time, they tend to be precisely because of that. This is a market that tends to be understood as a market with high barriers to entry and with a lot of difficulties for new or even competitors that are not so big or not so consolidated.
This has been a really interesting discussion, particularly when we were talking about the switch in policy towards labor markets. And I think we've definitely seen the same thing in the US. And there has been a philosophical shift, I think, in terms of whether the goal of antitrust is to make mergers easier on the corporations or whether it's consumers and the people that the corporations employ. So I think we're seeing a lot of the same things, not just in Brazil, but all over the world. You guys have covered a lot in this episode. It's been great. What are some of the key takeaways here for practitioners? Silvia, let's start with you.
Oh, I think one of the takeaways is it's very challenging to have the efficiencies being accepted for the antitrust authorities, but at the same time, I do understand they are going.
Yes, and if I can actually add to what Silvia mentioned and to the importance of efficiencies, I think like in Brazil we have a saying that say that if the authority is asking you for efficiencies, that might mean that your merger, o gato subiu do telhado, which actually means that your merger is not doing well because the authority is asking for efficiency. So it actually took the stance that, that might be a big problem. And that's not completely true because efficiencies can and should be used to justify the merger, or at least to help the authorities understand that the net effects of that merger are not, are not negative. And for that, especially after our conversation with Silvia, for me, it's even clearer today how important it is to engage economists early on to help you actually quantify them and show them that they're merger specific. They're not just a beautiful story that you're telling to marketing purposes.
Yeah, and even if the authority is not formally going to accept all the efficiencies, they certainly need to see the efficiencies even to engage in a remedy negotiation. Otherwise, if you're not showing that you're going to bring any benefit for the market, why should the authority have the cost or to accept that a merger that's going to increase concentration should be accepted? So do trust in the efficiencies because they are going to be important informally or formally in the process.
Well, Silvia, Paula, this has been great. I think for those of us who are not economists, it's sometimes not clear when you're talking about a merger and something that'll happen in the future, how you actually explain what the benefits are going to be. This has been a terrific explanation for efficiencies analysis and another great entry in our Mergernomics series. So thank you again to both of you. And for our listeners, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time. Trust and Trade.